Evelyn Hart pressed her back against the parlor wall and told herself not to breathe too loud. 10 women in silk and pearls stood in a perfect line across the room, each one prettier and richer than the last. They had spent their whole lives preparing for this morning. Evie had been preparing for nothing. She was there to fix a torn hem and stay invisible. That was all she'd ever been good for. Then, the door opened. Duke Grayson Harper walked in, and his eyes found hers before they found anyone else's. If you've ever been the one they overlooked, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Evelyn Hart had spent the better part of that summer morning on her knees, and her back was starting to let her know it. She kept her eyes down and her needle moving, threading the torn hem of Charlotte Aldridge's petticoat back together with the kind of speed that came from years of practice and zero alternatives. Around her, 10 of the finest young women in Virginia moved and fretted and adjusted their curls, filling the upstairs dressing room of Caldwell Hall with enough perfume and nervous energy to make a person dizzy. "Hold still," Evie said quietly, catching the fabric before Charlotte's foot could tear her work. Charlotte looked down at her with the expression of someone who had bitten into something sour. "I beg your pardon." "Your foot, ma'am. If you keep shifting, the hem'll pull crooked." Evie kept her voice flat and polite. She had long since stopped waiting for thank yous from the Aldridge women. "Give me 2 more minutes, and it'll be done right." Charlotte lifted her chin and went still, though not without making it clear through the rigid line of her shoulders that she was doing Evie a tremendous favor by cooperating. On the other side of the room, Lady Mirabelle Ashford finished her inspection of her own reflection and turned to address the room as though she already held the title of Duchess. By general agreement among the other 9 candidates, Mirabelle was the frontrunner. She carried that knowledge the way she carried everything, with the composed certainty of a woman who had never had to wonder whether she belonged. "Evelyn." She didn't bother looking in Evie's direction. "When you're done with Charlotte, check the ribbon on my left sleeve. It's looser than I'd like." "Yes, ma'am." Mirabelle's eyes cut briefly toward her, then a glance that lasted barely a second, the kind a person gave a piece of furniture they'd decided was slightly in the way. "And try not to hover. It makes you look desperate." Nobody in the room said anything. Nobody ever did. That was the thing about being Evelyn Hart at Caldwell Hall on a summer morning in 1815. You were essential enough to be called for and invisible enough to be talked over, and the gap between those two things was where you had learned to live. Evie bit the thread smooth and clean. "Done," she said to Charlotte. She rose and moved toward Mirabelle without being told twice. She didn't let herself think about the ribbon, or the room, or the 10 women who barely registered her existence. She thought instead about the letter that had been sitting on her family's kitchen table when she'd left home before sunrise, the one from Harwick Lending and Trust, addressed to her father in sharp, formal script. The one she hadn't had time to open. She thought about that, and she kept her hands steady. The commotion swept through the downstairs of Caldwell Hall, without warning, the way it always did when someone of consequence arrived ahead of schedule. Evie heard it first as a shift in the noise voices, dropping footsteps, quickening the particular hush that came over a room full of people who suddenly remembered they were being observed. Tilda, the hall's youngest housemaid, and the closest thing Evie had to an ally inside these walls, appeared in the dressing room doorway with her apron twisted in both hands. "He's here," she breathed. "The Duke. He came early. Mrs. Caldwell is Lord. She is not pleased." The room erupted. 10 women turned into one collective motion of panic. Gloves pulled on curls, padded postures, straightened so fast, Evie could practically hear spines snapping to attention. Mirabelle Ashford moved to the center of the group with the calm authority of someone who had been rehearsing this exact moment since childhood. She smoothed non-existent wrinkles from her skirt and arranged her expression into something that fell just short of a smile, interested without seeming eager, warm without appearing available. It was a precise expression, Evie had to admit, the product of considerable effort. "Do not crowd each other on the stairs," Mirabelle said, and the other 9 women moved apart as though she'd pushed them with her hands. We walk down together in order. Charlotte, fix your collar. Anne, your left glove is inside out. Evie reached for her sewing basket. Her job was finished. There was nothing left for her here. Heart. She stopped. Mirabelle was looking at her now, actually looking at her, which was enough of a rarity to be mildly alarming. Don't go yet. I may need you after the introductions. Wait in the hall. Evie thought about the walk home, about the letter. Yes, ma'am, she said. She followed them out and took her place in the corridor back against the wall, invisible as wallpaper, while 10 women in silk descended the grand staircase of Caldwell Hall to meet the man they'd all come here to impress. Duke Grayson Harper had not wanted to come to Virginia. He had said as much to his solicitor 3 weeks ago, in terms that had left very little room for misinterpretation. He had said it again to his cousin Edmund during the 2-day ride south from Philadelphia. He had said it to himself somewhere outside of Richmond, watching the road unspool through summer fields, and he had not found the argument any more convincing then than before. He was here because he had made a promise. A man who walked away from his promises was a man who walked away from himself. His father had told him that. His father had been right about very few things, but Grayson had held on to that one. He let Edmund handle the door. He stood in the front hall of Caldwell Hall while the Caldwell family gathered around him with the enthusiasm of people who had planned this day with military precision, and he accepted handshakes and pleasantries with the kind of surface-level graciousness that had carried him through a decade of events he hadn't wanted to attend. He was 31 years old. He owned property in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, and in England. He had more money than he would ever spend, and not one person in his life who spoke to him straight. He was here to find a wife. He understood that much. What he understood rather less was why the prospect made him feel as though he were signing a document he hadn't read. Mrs. Caldwell, small, sharp-eyed, and moving with the confident energy of a woman who had organized this event down to the final detail, led him toward the parlor. 10 wonderful young ladies, she told him, leaning into the word wonderful, the way people did when they wanted you to take it as fact. The very finest families in the state. I think you'll find Mrs. Caldwell. Grayson kept his voice pleasant. I appreciate your trouble. She took that as encouragement and kept talking. He stopped listening after the third name. The parlor held more flowers than people, or at least that was how it felt, and the scent of them was aggressive in the July heat. 10 candidates stood in a practiced line along the far wall, each one well-dressed, well-postured, and fully aware of being watched. Grayson Harper walked into that room and felt absolutely nothing. He moved down the line, the way you move through any formal obligation, steadily, with attention, giving each woman the courtesy of his gaze long enough to seem genuine. Charlotte Aldridge curtsied with precision. Anne Mercer smiled at exactly the right intensity. Mirabelle Ashford, who Edmund had warned him about in the tone you used for weather, met his eyes with an expression of such composed and calculated appeal that it was almost admirable. He said the appropriate things. He did not slow his pace. He was 3/4 through the room when he saw her. She was not in the line. She was sitting in a low chair near the far corner, not hiding exactly, but not presenting herself either. Just sitting, a small sewing basket at her feet, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, as though she'd decided the polite thing was to pretend she wasn't there at all. She wore a plain gray dress that had nothing to recommend it besides cleanliness and fit. Her hair was pinned back without fuss. She looked in every possible way like a woman who had never expected to be looked at. Grayson Harper stopped walking. Edmund materialized at his elbow. "Your Grace," he murmured. "The candidates are still—" "Who is that?" Grayson said. The question was quiet enough that only Edmund heard it. But the pause in his movement was not. 10 women noticed. Mrs. Caldwell noticed. Half the room swung its attention like a compass needle finding north. Edmund followed his gaze and blinked. "That's the seamstress, Your Grace. Called in this morning for repairs. She's nobody. Evelyn Hart. Her family has a small property on the eastern side of the county." "Hart," Grayson repeated. "Her father is, well, the financial situation is rather complicated. Nothing that concerns—" "Thank you, Edmund." Grayson resumed walking. He finished the line. He said everything expected of him. But at the edge of his attention, he was watching the girl in the gray dress, who was doing everything in her power not to meet his eyes, and doing it very badly. Evie was aware of him the way you were aware of a storm front not quite there yet, but impossible to ignore. She had watched the Duke move through the room from the corner of her eye because looking directly was not something she was willing to do, with Mirabelle Ashford's attention shifting the way it did whenever anyone behaved unexpectedly. She had watched him speak to Charlotte, speak to Mirabelle, work his way down the line with the measured ease of a man who had done this before and found it neither difficult nor interesting. She was thinking about the letter. She was thinking about her father's hands, how they'd looked last winter shaking over the accounting ledgers, while he told her everything was fine in a voice that meant nothing was. She was not thinking about Duke Grayson Harper. Then the room went quiet in a particular way, a silence with weight behind it, and she looked up without meaning to. He was looking at her, not past her, not in her general direction. At her with the steady directness of a man who had stopped caring what the room thought he should be focused on. Evie looked back down at her hands. She heard his footsteps cross the room. She looked up again when they stopped in front of her chair. Grayson Harper was taller than she'd expected and quieter. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, not unkind, but contained like a man who had learned to think before he let anything show. He was looking at her with the same directness he'd had from across the room, and it had not gotten less unnerving up close. "Miss Hart," he said. The room's attention pressed in like summer heat. Evie rose, because sitting while a duke stood in front of you was not something she was willing to do regardless of what else was happening. She kept her chin level. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon for being in the way. I was asked to wait." "You're not in the way." His eyes dropped briefly to the sewing basket, then back to her. "The hemwork this morning that was yours on Miss Aldridge's gown?" Evie blinked. "It was." "You work quickly. I've had practice." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the thing that came before one. "How long have you been here today?" "Since before first light, Your Grace. Mrs. Caldwell wanted everything settled before you arrived." "And were you included in the settling?" "I was not." She said it plainly without softening it, because there was no version of this conversation in which making it sound better actually made it better. "I'm here in a working capacity, not as a candidate." He held her gaze. "I know." Evie waited. She could feel Mirabelle's eyes on her back, the way you felt a blade before it moved. "Your father is Thomas Hart," Grayson said. Not a question. Something cold moved through her. "He is. I've been made aware of some business he has with Harwick Lending and Trust." The cold settled into something harder. She kept her face still. "I wouldn't know anything about that, Your Grace." "No." He studied her without any particular urgency. "He's your father." "He is. He doesn't discuss financial matters with me." She paused one breath. "Forgive me, is there something I can help you with, in a working capacity?" The almost smile came back. "There may be, but not today." He held her gaze one moment longer, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be deniable, then inclined his head in something that might have been a bow and turned away. Evie's hands were absolutely still. Her heart was not. Thank. The fury when it came was elegant. That was the thing about Mirabelle Ashford. She never did anything common. She found Evie in the upstairs corridor 20 minutes later, when the Duke had been escorted to meet with the men of the household, and the candidates had been released to gather themselves before supper. She walked toward Evie with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never had to raise her voice to make a point land. "I want to be very clear with you," Mirabelle said, stopping an arm's length away. Her expression was pleasant. It did not reach her eyes. "What happened downstairs was nothing." "I agree with you, ma'am," Evie said. "He was being polite. He's known for it. It doesn't mean anything." "I didn't think it did. Your family's situation is not a secret, Evelyn." Mirabelle's voice turned gentle in the particular way of a person being gentle on purpose. Your father borrowed against everything he had, and the note is coming due. Lord Harwick holds a great deal of interest in that lending house. He is not a patient man. She tilted her head slightly. I say this because I think it would be unwise for you to get ideas. Any ideas at all. Evie met her gaze and held it. I haven't gotten any ideas, Lady Mirabelle. Good. Mirabelle adjusted a ring on her right hand, a gesture she used when she considered a conversation finished. Then we understand each other. She walked away. Evie watched her go. Then Tilda appeared at the far end of the corridor, quiet and quick, with her apron twisted in her hands, and an expression Evie had never seen on her face before. A pressed-together, frightened kind of look. The look of someone carrying news they wished they weren't carrying. You heard, Evie said. Enough. Tilda stepped close, dropping her voice. Evie, Lord Harwick arrived an hour ago. He came with papers, something official. She swallowed. He wants your father's property. He's saying the note is already past due. Evie went very still. He's got a document dated July. He's saying the debt came due 2 months ago. It can't be July. Evie's voice was steady. The agreement date was September. I saw it. He's got a copy that says otherwise. Tilda's hands tightened on her apron. And it's got signatures. Evie looked at the wall in front of her. She thought about her father's hands trembling over the ledgers. She thought about the locked box at the bottom of his desk drawer, the one he believed she didn't know about. The one that held the account records she had found by accident 2 winters past. The ones that showed numbers that did not match what anyone in Harwick County believed Thomas Hart to be worth. Tell me exactly what Harwick said, she told Tilda. Every word. Size. By the time Tilda finished, Evie had heard enough to know what the next several days were going to cost her. July. Lord Harwick had produced a paper dated July, which meant the note was past due by 2 full months, which meant her father's 60 acres, the land her grandfather had broken and her father had kept, could be seized before summer's end. No recourse, no appeal, nothing but Harwick's signature and a sympathetic judge, and a lifetime of her family's labor walking out the door in the hands of a man who had never grown a single thing in his life. Does my father know? She said. I don't think so. He wasn't at the hall this morning. No, he wouldn't be. Thomas Hart hadn't set foot in Caldwell Hall in 11 years, not since the old bad blood between their families had made the air too thick for manners. Which meant nobody had thought to tell him, and nobody would, and by the time word reached him, it would likely be too late to matter. Evie walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the summer afternoon long green lawns, heat shimmering off the fields, the row of carriages still arranged in the drive. One of those carriages bore the Harper crest. She thought about the Duke again. She thought about the particular way he had said your father's name, not surprised, not curious, but placed. Like a man setting down a piece he had already been holding in a spot he had already chosen. She didn't know what he wanted. She didn't know why he had crossed that parlor and stopped in front of her chair when there were 10 women prepared their whole lives to be noticed by a man like him. What she knew was this. Lord Harwick had a paper dated July, and somewhere in her father's locked desk was a ledger that told a very different story about what Thomas Hart owed and to whom. If those numbers were real, if they said what Evie believed they said, then the document Harwick was waving around was worth nothing at all. She couldn't prove it yet, but she would. Tilda was watching her with the expression of someone who had learned to read Evie's silences and didn't always like what they said. What are you going to do? Evie adjusted the handle of her sewing basket. Tonight, she said, I'm going home and I'm opening that desk. And if it isn't what you think. She looked down the corridor toward the sound of voices rising from the lower floors, the easy murmur of men with power deciding things about people who weren't in the room. Then I'll figure out the next thing, she said. She went downstairs. She passed the parlor. She passed the hall where Edmund stood with 2 other gentlemen in low conversation. She was almost to the front door when a voice stopped her. Miss Hart. Duke Grayson Harper stood just inside the study doorway, and from the way he was positioned, She understood that he had placed himself there with intention. She stopped. She did not step toward him. She kept 3 feet of hallway between them and her expression even. "Your Grace, you're leaving. My work is finished." He looked at her with that same unhurried attention he had given her in the parlor, and she braced herself, for she didn't know exactly what she was bracing for. Not what came next. "Lord Harwick arrived this afternoon," he said. "I'm aware." "Are you aware of what he brought with him?" "I've been informed." She kept her voice steady. She was quite good at keeping her voice steady. It was the one skill nobody had ever told her was useless. Grayson was quiet for a moment. Somewhere behind her, a man laughed a sound from a world that had never needed to worry about locked desk drawers or documents with the wrong dates on them. "Your father built that property himself," Grayson said. "He shouldn't lose it to paperwork that doesn't hold up." Evie's breath caught very slightly. "I didn't tell you anything about my father's property." "No, you didn't." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite readable, not quite hidden. "I have my own sources, Miss Hart. I came to this county for more than one reason." She looked at him. She waited for the rest of it. He did not give her the rest. What he gave her instead was something smaller and more unexpected, a level, plain honesty that cut straight through the summer heat. "I don't think you should be afraid," he said quietly. "I think you should be very careful. There's a difference." Then he stepped back into the study, and the door closed between them, and Evie was alone in the hallway with her sewing basket and her steady hands and a heartbeat that had, for the second time that day, forgotten its manners entirely. She walked to the front door. She opened it. She stepped into the afternoon, and the heat pressed in against her like a hand laid flat on her chest. "Don't be afraid. Be careful." She turned those words over as she walked down the drive, past the Harper carriage, past the magnolias, past the long, beautiful lawns of Caldwell Hall that had never once been hers. She had a father to find, a desk to open, and a fight she hadn't started but had no intention of losing. That was enough for right now. Thomas Hart was sitting at the kitchen table when Evie came through the door, and she knew from the way he was sitting, not doing anything, just sitting, hands flat on the wood, that he already knew. "Papa." He looked up. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally set it down, not because he'd found a safe place for it, but because he couldn't hold it anymore. "You were at Caldwell Hall this morning," he said. "I was." She set her sewing basket on the floor and sat across from him. She did not soften her voice or draw it out. She had learned from her mother, God rest her, that the kindest thing you could do for a man in pain was to speak to him plainly. "Lord Harwick came to the hall today. He brought papers." Her father's jaw tightened. "I know." "He's saying the note came due in July." "I know that too." "Papa." She waited until he met her eyes. "The agreement date was September. I saw it. 3 years ago when you signed it, I saw the date on the document." Thomas Hart's eyes dropped to the table. "Things change," he said. That was when Evie understood it was worse than she'd thought. What changed? Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Tell me exactly what changed." He didn't answer right away. He pressed his palms against the table the way he did when he was measuring something, not weight, but resolve. 6 months ago, Harwick came to me with a new version of the agreement. He said there'd been a clerical error in the original. Said the due date had always been July and the September date was a mistake. Thomas paused. He had 2 witnesses. "And you signed the new version." "I didn't have a lawyer, Evie. I didn't have—" He stopped himself, swallowed hard. "I didn't think he'd move this fast." Evie looked at her father for a long moment. He was 62 years old. He had worked that land since he was 19. He had never once asked anyone for help with anything, because asking for help was a thing that had been trained out of him by a life that hadn't offered much. "Where is the original document?" she said. "Gone. He took it back when I signed the new one, said it was standard practice." "And you let him?" Thomas looked at her. There was nothing defensive in his expression, just the flat, exhausted acknowledgement of a man who already knew what he'd done wrong. "Yes," he said. "I let him." Evie pushed back from the table and stood. "Then we go to the box." Her father went very still. "What box?" She looked at him steadily. "Papa, I found it 2 winters ago. I wasn't snooping. The drawer was already open. I didn't touch it, didn't open, it didn't say a word because you clearly didn't want me knowing about it." She held his gaze. "But whatever is in that box is the only thing we have right now, so we're going to look at it together." Thomas Hart stared at his daughter for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not embarrassment, just the quiet surrender of a man who had run out of road. Then he stood without a word and walked toward the study. The box was smaller than Evie remembered plain wood, no larger than a Bible with a brass latch her father opened with a key from his house ring. He set it on the desk and stepped back, and Evie opened it. Inside were 3 things: a folded letter, a small leather-bound ledger, and a second handwritten document bearing a date in the upper right corner. She picked up the ledger first. She was not an accountant. She'd learned arithmetic at the county schoolhouse and kept her own household accounts since her mother died, and that was the sum of her formal training. But she could read numbers, and as she turned through the pages of her father's private ledger, the one he had never shown a banker, a lender, or a single soul outside this room, she understood page by page that the picture was not what Harwick was painting. The amounts were all there. The loans, the payments, the interest. But so was something else, a series of payments made against the principal that did not appear anywhere in the official Harwick lending records. 12 payments. Regular. Documented in her father's own handwriting, with dates and amounts and notes on how each one had been delivered. If these payments were real, and she had no reason to believe her father had invented them, then the note was not past due. Not in July, not in September, not for another 2 years at minimum. "Papa." Something in her voice made him step forward immediately. "These payments, all of these." "Every one," he said quietly. "I kept every receipt." She looked up fast. "Where are the receipts?" He reached past her and lifted the bottom of the box. A false panel she hadn't seen. Underneath it was a folded paper packet tied with string. Evie untied it with hands that were not entirely steady. The receipts were there, 12 of them, each one bearing the Harwick lending seal and the signature of the clerk who had processed the payment. She sat down hard in the desk chair. "He knew," she said. "Harwick knew about every single one of these. He processed them himself, looked the same clerk signature on all 12. He took our money, then he told you there was a clerical error, then he took the original document." She looked at her father. "He's been stealing from us. He's been planning this for months." Thomas Hart sat on the edge of the desk, and for the first time in as long as Evie could remember, he looked like a man whose age was showing through. "I know," he said. "How long have you known?" "I suspected when he came with the new agreement. I didn't want to believe it." He looked at his hands. "A man doesn't want to believe he was fooled that completely. You weren't fooled." She said it firmly because he needed to hear it said firmly. "You kept every receipt. You documented every payment. You did everything right. He's the one who—" She stopped. Voices. Outside. More than one. Her father heard them too. He straightened from the desk. "Mog." Lord Harwick did not knock. That was the first thing. He opened the front door of the Hart house the way a man opened a door he already believed belonged to him fully, without hesitation, with 2 men behind him whose purpose was not decorative. Evie was in the front room before her father could get there first. She stepped into the doorway with the box tucked under one arm and the receipt packet in her hand, and she looked at Lord Harwick the way she had learned to look at people who wanted her to feel small, steadily, without flinching, with her chin exactly level. Harwick was a large man who used his size the way some men used their money, as a fact of the room that everyone was expected to acknowledge and nobody was supposed to challenge. He was somewhere past 50, with a wide face and a practiced air of reasonable authority, that Evie had always found more frightening than open hostility. Open hostility at least showed you where things stood. "Miss Hart." His voice was cordial. "I was looking for your father. Here I am," Thomas said from behind her. Harwick's eyes moved to Thomas, then back to Evie, and something shifted in them, a small recalculation quick and controlled. "I've come to discuss the property agreement. Given the delinquency of the note—" "The note isn't delinquent," Evie said. Harwick paused. Just a half beat. The pause of a man who hadn't expected the interruption, or hadn't expected it from her specifically. "Miss Hart, this is a business matter between my father and your lending house." She took one step forward. "And I'm my father's representative in this discussion, so you can speak to me." She lifted the receipt packet. "We have documentation of 12 payments made against the principal of this note. 12. All processed through your office, all bearing your clerk's signature, all predating the due date on the original agreement, the September agreement, which you know as well as I do was the real one." The two men behind Harwick exchanged a glance. Harwick did not move, but something in his face went very carefully still. "I don't know what your father has told you," he said, and his voice stayed cordial, which was the most frightening thing about it. "But the document you had him sign 6 months ago." "Yes." She held his gaze. "The one that replaced the original, the one with 2 witnesses whose names I'd very much like to verify." She tilted her head slightly. "I'd also like to know what a circuit court judge would think of a lender who documented payments in his own records and then claimed the debt was outstanding. I imagine they'd have some questions." Harwick looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. It was the smile of a man who had just changed which card he was playing. "You're a clever girl," he said. "Your father always said so." "Don't talk about my father. I'm simply noting." He clasped his hands in front of him, unhurried, unrattled the picture of patient authority. "Receipts and ledgers are one thing, Miss Hart. Courts take time. Judges have calendars. And properties can change hands in the interval while everyone is waiting for a hearing." He paused just long enough for that to settle. "It would be a shame if something happened to this house in the meantime. Accidents do occur. Summer is very dry this year." The room went silent. Thomas Hart took a step forward. Evie put her hand out and stopped him without turning her head. "Get out of my family's house," she said. Her voice was quiet. It did not shake. "Get out and tell the men you brought to get off our land. And understand that every word you just said in this room has been heard by 2 witnesses." Harwick's eyes moved around the room. There was nobody else there. "Have it your way," he said pleasantly. He turned toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. "A word of advice, Miss Hart. The people you might think of going to for help, they have their own interests. Don't mistake attention for protection." Then he walked out. His men followed, and the door closed behind them. Evie stood in the middle of the room and breathed. "Evie." Her father's voice was rough. "What he said about the house. I heard it. That was a threat. I know it was. We can't fight him alone." Thomas's voice was not defeated. It was something more honest than that, a man taking an honest inventory. "He has the judge in his pocket. Everybody knows it. He has the county clerk, he doesn't have the receipts." She turned around. "And he doesn't have whatever connection Duke Harper has to this county." She watched her father's face change. "The Duke knows about Harwick, Papa. He came here for more than the selection, he told me so himself." Thomas stared at her. "When did you speak to the Duke?" "Today. Twice." She set the box and the receipts on the table. "He knew your name. He knew about the lending house. He was careful about it. He didn't give me anything direct, but he was careful in a specific way. The way you are when you already know the answer and you're trying to find out how much the other person knows. Evie, I'm not imagining things. I didn't say you were." Her father sat down slowly. "I said be careful. Harper is a powerful man, and powerful men don't ride to Virginia in the summer without a reason that serves themselves first. Maybe his reason serves us too. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Maybe, he said. Or maybe you're putting faith in a man who crossed a parlor to speak to you and you don't yet know why. Evie had no clean answer for that. She picked up the receipt packet instead. I'm taking these to Caldwell Hall tomorrow, she said. If Harper knows something about Harwick, I need to know what it is before Harwick moves again. And if he doesn't help you, then I'll figure out the next thing. She had said those same words to Tilda just hours ago, and she meant them just as much now. That's what we do, Papa. We figure out the next thing. Thomas Hart looked at his daughter with an expression she recognized from her childhood. The look he wore when she had done something that surprised him, and he didn't want her to see it. Your mother would have liked to see this, he said quietly. Evie didn't answer. She tucked the receipts into the inside pocket of her dress and went to make supper. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and thought through every word Harwick had said in order looking for the things she might have missed. Accidents do occur. She turned that phrase over until its shape was worn smooth, until she knew exactly what it was designed to make her do, which was to doubt, to retreat, to decide that winning was less important than the house still standing in the morning. She was not going to do that. What she was going to do was go to Caldwell Hall in the morning, find a way to speak to someone with the authority to make Harwick's forged document worthless, and hold on to those receipts until she had that conversation. She was halfway through that resolution when she heard the sound. Small, deliberate. The sound of someone moving across the back of the property with the specific carefulness of a person who did not want to be heard. Evie was out of bed before she finished identifying what she'd heard. She crossed to the window, looked out into the July dark, and saw two things: the glow of a lamp moving along the fence line of their eastern pasture, and the silhouette of a man crouching near the old storage barn. She pulled on her boots. She did not wake her father. There was no time, and also Thomas Hart's first instinct was always to put himself between Evie and anything moving in the dark, which would make the situation louder and more complicated than she needed right now. She went out the back, kept low, moved along the shadow of the house wall until she was close enough to see clearly. There were two of them. Not near the barn she had been wrong about, that they were near the fence on the property's eastern boundary, the line that separated the Heartland from the parcel Harwick had been trying to absorb for 4 years. One had a lamp. The other had what looked like a survey stake, freshly cut pale against the dark ground. They were marking the boundary line. At midnight, without notice, in the middle of July. Evie straightened and walked directly toward them. "Stop," she said. Both men spun around. The one with the stake dropped it. "Who sent you?" Her voice carried across the dark without effort. "Pick that up," she said to the one who'd dropped it, "and give it to me." The man with the lamp raised it to see her better. He was older, weathered, with an expression trying to decide whether she was a problem worth handling. "Ma'am, this is a survey commission. At midnight." She held out her hand for the stake. "On private property, without the landowner's knowledge or consent." She waited. The stake. The younger man looked at the older one. A small, reluctant nod. She took the stake, examined it, unmarked wood. No official seal, no survey authority markings of any kind, and then looked at the older man. "You tell whoever hired you that we've already started the legal process," she said, "and that 2 witnesses saw you here tonight, and that if anyone sets foot on this property again, without Thomas Hart's permission, I'll have the sheriff out here before morning." She paused. "Go." They went. She stood in the dark and waited until she heard their horse move away down the eastern road. Then she let herself breathe. When she turned around, someone was standing at the edge of the property. Her heart lurched so hard, she put her hand flat against the fence post to steady herself. "Easy," said a voice she knew. Grayson Harper stepped forward into the reach of the moonlight, and Evie stared at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "What," she said, "are you doing on my father's land?" "I was riding past." He stopped a respectful distance away. I heard voices. You were riding past our property, in the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep. He said it without any particular embarrassment. I ride when I can't sleep. It's a long habit. He glanced toward the road where the two men had disappeared. Did Harwick send them? They didn't say. They didn't have to. She looked down at the stake still in her hand, then lowered it. They were marking the boundary line, trying to move it. He's moving faster than I expected. Grayson said it quietly, more to himself than her. You expected it, Evie said. He looked at her. You expected him to move. You've been watching Harwick. She stepped closer because this was her land, and she was not going to have this conversation at a disadvantage. How long? He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't evasion. The quiet of a man deciding how much truth to offer and whether the person in front of him had earned it. 8 months, he said. Harwick has been running the same scheme across 4 counties. He finds properties with notes. He holds, alters the documents, moves on the land before anyone can mount a legal challenge. Your father's property isn't the only one. He paused. It's the one that matters most to me right now because it sits on the eastern boundary of land I purchased last spring. If Harwick absorbs your father's parcel, he controls the water access to my property. Evie processed that. So this is about your land. It started that way. He held her gaze steady. It doesn't only feel that way anymore. The silence that followed that statement was the loudest thing she had heard all day. I found the receipts, she said, because if she let that last statement sit any longer, she was going to do something imprudent. 12 payments against the principal, all documented, all bearing Harwick's own clerk's seal. The original agreement date was September. Everything he's claiming is fabricated. Grayson's expression didn't change, but something in his bearing shifted, a settling like a man who had just had a calculation confirmed. Do you have them with you? They're in the house. I want to see them. He said it directly without apology. Tonight, if possible. I have a lawyer in Philadelphia who has been building a case against Harwick for 6 months. What you're describing could be the piece we've been missing, proof of the fraudulent alterations from the debtor's side, not just the pattern we've identified from the outside. Evie looked at him in the dark and thought about what her father had said. Powerful men don't ride to Virginia without a reason that serves themselves. Your water access, she said. Yes. If we win, if this goes to a judge and the original agreement is upheld, your property is protected too. Yes. So your help isn't charity? No. He said it plainly without embarrassment. It's not charity. It's the same fight from 2 different positions. But Miss Hart... He paused. The outcome is identical either way. Your father keeps his land. Harwick loses his leverage. Whatever my reasons, the direction we're pointed is the same. Evie looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the place in this where the trap was, because she had been raised in a world where someone always wanted something you didn't realize you were already giving away. She couldn't find the trap. Come inside, she said. I'll wake my father. Thomas Hart did not take the news of a duke standing in his kitchen at midnight with the equanimity of a man who had been expecting it. He sat very still at the table for a full 10 seconds after Evie made the introductions, and then he said, I see, in a voice that made clear he did not yet see but was working on it. Grayson Harper sat down across from him without being invited, which was either very arrogant or very practical, and Evie decided it was probably both in equal measure. Mr. Hart, he said, I'll be direct with you because I think you're a man who prefers it. I am, Thomas said. I've been gathering evidence against Harwick for the better part of a year. I have 8 other property owners across 4 counties who have experienced versions of what you've experienced, altered documents, false witnesses, night surveys, the whole pattern. I have a lawyer ready to take this to a federal circuit judge who is not in Harwick's pocket. He paused. What I don't have is the debtor side documentation, receipts of payment made. Your records could tie the entire case together. Thomas looked at the packet of receipts sitting on the table. Then he looked at Grayson. And what do you want in return? Nothing, Grayson said. except to win. Thomas studied him the way he studied weather, reading it for what it was actually saying underneath what it appeared to say. My daughter tells me you came to this county for a bride selection. I did. And yet here you are in my kitchen at midnight. Grayson held the older man's gaze without flinching. Yes, sir, he said. Here I am. Thomas looked at Evie. She kept her expression neutral and her chin level and did not give him anything useful to read. All right, Thomas said slowly. Show him the receipts. They worked at the kitchen table until the hour was past reasonable and edging toward morning. Grayson went through each receipt with the methodical attention of a man who had spent real time with legal documents, turning them toward the lamplight, checking clerk signatures, matching dates against a small notebook he produced from his coat pocket. Evie sat across from him and answered his questions when he had them, which was often. In between, she watched him work and thought about all the things she didn't know about this man, which was most things, which was a fact she needed to hold on to carefully. But she also watched his hands, which were careful with the papers. And she watched his face, which was concentrated and unguarded in the way faces got when a person thought they weren't being observed. And she thought about the way he'd said, "It doesn't only feel that way anymore," in the dark of the pasture, quiet and matter of fact, like a man reporting something true rather than performing something charming. She thought about that, and she pressed the thought flat. This one, he said, holding up the 11th receipt. This date 3 months before the altered agreement was signed. This puts payment beyond any reasonable dispute that the original September date was genuine. He looked up at her. This is the one that breaks it open. That's the one he doesn't know about, Evie said. When he took the original document, he didn't know about the box. My father never told him. Grayson set the receipt down carefully. He looked at Thomas, who had fallen asleep in his chair an hour ago, and was still there, breathing slow and even. Then he looked at Evie. He's going to move again, he said quietly. When his men report back that you turned them off, he'll know you have something. He won't wait to find out what it is. I know. The hearing needs to happen before he can manufacture another document or find a way to discredit these. He tapped the receipt packet. I need to get these to my lawyer in Philadelphia by the end of the week. And you? He paused. You need to be somewhere Harwick can't reach you directly while the legal process moves. Evie looked at him. I'm not leaving my father's property. I'm not asking you to leave it. He met her eyes steadily. I'm asking you to understand that this fight has 2 fronts now. The legal one and the personal one. And Harwick doesn't fight fair on either. She thought about the 2 men in the dark. The survey stake. Accidents do occur. What are you suggesting? She said. Grayson was quiet for a moment. Come back to Caldwell Hall tomorrow. In your working capacity, if that's what you want to call it. It keeps you visible. It keeps you connected to people. Harwick won't move against directly, and it keeps me close enough to act if he does something I'm not expecting. Evie studied him across the table. That's very convenient for you. Yes, he said. It is. I'd be at the hall, under the same roof as Lady Mirabelle and Lord Harwick, and 10 women whose entire purpose is to secure your attention. I'm aware of the guest list. And you think I should simply... I think, he said quietly, and without any particular drama, that you are the most capable person I have spoken to in this county. I think Harwick underestimates you, which is the only advantage you have that he cannot take away. And I think that right now the safest place for you and for these receipts is somewhere visible and public. He held her gaze. And I am whatever else I may be, a man who does not lose the things he's decided to protect. Evie looked at him across the lamplight. She was trying to find the place in this where she was being managed rather than helped. She was trying to locate the moment where this stopped being honest and started being strategic. She couldn't find it. I'll think about it, she said. Grayson nodded, and something in him settled by a fraction, not relief exactly, but something quieter and less guarded than anything he'd shown her yet. That's enough for tonight. He rose from the table, careful not to disturb Thomas, and took his hat from the chair where he'd set it. At the door, he stopped. Miss Hart. Your Grace. What Harwick said tonight about accidents. A pause. He said the same words to 2 other families in this county. One of them didn't take it seriously. She waited for the rest. He turned to look at her. "Don't be one of those families," he said. Then the door opened and closed, and the kitchen was quiet except for the lamp and her father's breathing, and the stack of receipts on the table that could take down a man who had never once believed that anyone would find the nerve to try. Evie put her hand flat on top of the packet and held it there. Outside, the summer dark was deep and still, and somewhere down the eastern road, Harwick's hired men were riding back to deliver a report that was going to make a dangerous man very angry very quickly. She thought about that. She thought about what Grayson had said, the only advantage you have that he cannot take away, and she turned it over the same way she had turned over. Don't be afraid. Be careful. Looking at it from every angle, deciding whether it was the truth or the shape of something that looked like truth. It felt like the truth. That was the problem. Because the truth in her experience was rarely this straightforward, and men who offered it this cleanly in the middle of the night usually wanted something she hadn't been asked for yet. But the receipts were real. The clerk's signatures were real. The case Grayson Harper was describing was real, or real enough that he had ridden 8 months toward it and shown up in her kitchen and sat across from her father without once pretending to be something other than what he was. That was something. She didn't know yet if it was enough. She let the lamp burn low and sat in the quiet of her family's kitchen and made a list in her head of everything she knew for certain, everything she suspected, and everything she was going to need before this was over. The list of things she knew for certain was short. The list of things she was going to need was long. And somewhere in the middle of both lists, taking up more space than she had given him permission to take, was a duke who rode at midnight and told her plainly that she was the smartest person in the room, in a tone that made her believe against her better judgment that he actually meant it. Harwick had no idea what kind of woman he had decided to threaten. He was going to find out soon enough. She decided at first light. Not because she had talked herself into trusting him, she hadn't, not entirely, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but because the alternative was staying home and waiting for Harwick to make his next move, and waiting had never been something Evie did well. She could be cautious, and she could be strategic, but she could not be still while the ground shifted under her feet. She told her father over breakfast, quick and plain, she was going to Caldwell Hall. She was taking the receipts. She was going to find out what Grayson Harper knew and what he was willing to do with it, and she was going to make a decision from there. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Take the original ledger too." She took it. The mood at Caldwell Hall had changed overnight, and Evie felt it the moment she came through the service entrance. Tilda met her in the back corridor, with an expression that was equal parts relief and alarm, which was never a good combination on Tilda's face. "How bad?" Evie said. "Lady Mirabelle knows you spoke to the Duke last night." Tilda fell into step beside her, voice low. "Not about she doesn't know the details, but one of the upstairs maids has a loose mouth, and apparently someone saw his carriage leave the hall late and come back near dawn." Evie kept walking. "That's not evidence of anything. It doesn't need to be evidence. It only needs to be a story." Tilda caught her arm. "She's been in with Mrs. Caldwell since before breakfast, and Lord Harwick arrived an hour ago. He wasn't invited for today." Evie stopped. "He came with a man I don't recognize," Tilda continued. "Not from the county. He brought a leather case, the kind lawyers carry." Everything in Evie's chest went very quiet and very focused. "Where are they now?" "The east sitting room. Mrs. Caldwell is with them. And the Duke, in the library, alone." Evie adjusted the strap of her basket, felt the weight of the ledger and the receipt packet inside it, and made a decision. "I need 10 minutes, she said. "Don't let anyone tell Harwick I'm here." Tilda nodded and disappeared. The library door was closed, but not locked. Evie knocked twice and opened it without waiting for an answer, because waiting for an answer was the kind of thing that gave people time to say no. Grayson Harper was standing at the window with a letter in his hand, and he turned at the sound of the door with the particular alertness of someone who had not slept much. When he saw it was her, something in his posture shifted, not relaxed exactly, but less braced. "You came," he said. "Harwick is here." She closed the door behind her. "He brought a lawyer. They're with Mrs. Caldwell in the East sitting room right now." Grayson set the letter down. "How long ago?" "An hour, maybe more." She set her basket on the nearest chair and pulled out the ledger. "I brought the original, all the entries, all 12 payment dates, and the receipts." He crossed the room and took the ledger from her hands, and she watched him scan the first 3 pages with the speed of someone who knew exactly what to look for. "This is good," he said. He said it quietly, but there was something underneath the words, a current of real feeling, that he had kept mostly under control until just now. "This is very good, Miss Hart." "Tell me what your lawyer has," she said. "All of it. No more pieces." He looked at her. "Edmund rode for Philadelphia last night. I sent him after I left your property. My lawyer, a man named Caldwell Briggs, has been building the case file for 8 months. He has sworn affidavits from 3 other property owners, documented evidence of the same clerk's signature appearing on altered agreements in 2 other counties, and a letter from a land registrar in Richmond who identified the same false witness names appearing on multiple documents across Harwick's portfolio." Grayson paused. What he didn't have was a debtor-side receipt trail. Proof that Harwick accepted payment and then denied it. "Your receipts are the piece that turns the pattern into proof." Evie processed that. "How long before Edmund gets back?" 2 days, maybe 3. "We don't have 2 days." She met his eyes. "Harwick moved last night. He'll move again today. If he gets a county judge to sign off on the seizure before your lawyer arrives." "He won't." Grayson said it with a certainty that stopped her. "Because I've already filed." She stared at him. "You filed? When?" 6 weeks ago. Not in county court, federal circuit. Judge Harold Patton out of Richmond. He is not in Harwick's pocket." He held her gaze. "I wasn't certain enough of the evidence to move until I saw your receipts last night. But the filing was already in place. What changes now is that it moves from preliminary to active." Evie stood very still. "You were already 6 weeks into this when you arrived here." "Yes." "And you came to the selection anyway." "I made a promise." He said it simply without elaboration, and she remembered him saying the same thing about his father and about the kind of man who walked away from his word. "But what I found here—" He stopped. "The case became more urgent than I expected, for more than one reason." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone knocked on the library door hard and without any of the politeness that usually preceded it, and the moment broke. It was not Tilda. It was Charlotte Aldridge, and Charlotte's face had the look of someone who had been elected against her will to deliver bad news. "Miss Hart," she said, glancing between Evie and the Duke, with barely concealed fascination. "Lord Harwick has asked that all guests and staff assemble in the main hall. Mrs. Caldwell has agreed." She hesitated. "He says it concerns a legal matter. He says everyone should hear it." Grayson looked at Evie. Evie looked at the ledger still in his hands. "Give me that," she said. He did. She put it in the basket with the receipts, picked it up, and walked out of the library. The main hall of Caldwell Hall held a strange collection of people that morning. The 10 candidates had arranged themselves along the left wall with the careful positioning of women who had been told to be present without being told why, and several of them wore the expression of people who suspected the day had veered off its intended course. The household staff stood near the back, Tilda among them, her apron twisted in both hands. Edmund's absence left a visible gap in the group of gentlemen near the door. Lord Harwick stood at the center of the room with the man Tilda had described, lean, formal, carrying the leather case, and with Lady Mirabelle at his left elbow, in a position that was too precise to be accidental. Evie saw that and filed it away. Mrs. Caldwell stood to the side with the expression of a woman whose carefully organized event had been commandeered, and who was too socially constrained to say so out loud. She caught Evie's eye when Evie entered and looked at her with something that might have been apology. Grayson came in behind Evie and took a position near the fireplace without any announcement. The room adjusted to his presence, the way rooms always did, quietly and completely. Harwick let the silence settle. He was good at that, using quiet the way other men used noise. "Thank you all for gathering," he said in the tone of a man who had not left any room for not gathering. "I apologize for the interruption to the day's proceedings. This matter concerns the Hart property on the Eastern County Road, and I want it addressed here in the presence of witnesses, so there can be no confusion about what has been decided." He nodded to the man with the leather case who produced a folded document and held it open. "This is a writ of seizure signed by County Judge Abram Hollis, authorizing the transfer of the Hart property in satisfaction of an outstanding debt to Harwick Lending and Trust. The debt is past due. The borrower has failed to respond to written notice. The transfer will proceed as of this morning." He looked at Evie, not at anyone else, at her. "I thought it only right," he said pleasantly, "that Miss Hart be made aware in a public setting so she cannot later claim she was not informed." The room was very still. Evie walked forward. She heard the intake of breath from somewhere along the left wall. Charlotte, she thought, and she felt Mirabelle's attention sharpen like a blade being drawn, and she felt all of it registered, all of it, and set it aside because she needed every available thought for what she was about to do. She stopped 3 feet from Harwick and looked at him with her chin level and her hand steady. Then she reached into her basket and pulled out the receipt packet. 12 payments, she said clearly enough for the entire room to hear. 12 payments made against the principal of this note, processed through your office, signed by your own clerk, all predating the due date on the original September agreement. She held the packet up. "The debt is not outstanding. It was never outstanding. And the writ your judge signed was based on a document that replaced a legitimate agreement under fraudulent circumstances." Harwick's expression did not change. That was what made him dangerous, the face that didn't move. "Those are serious allegations, Miss Hart." "They are," she agreed. "They're also documented." She set the receipts on the side table nearest to her, where anyone in the room could reach them. "The original payment ledger is here as well in my father's own handwriting, with the dates and amounts matched to each receipt." The man with the leather case looked at Harwick. A brief look, the kind that asked a question without asking it out loud. "Receipts can be fabricated," Harwick said. Still pleasant, still calm. "So can agreements," Evie said. Something moved in the room, a collective shift like people adjusting their weight. Tilda made a small sound near the back wall. "The witnesses on the altered agreement," Evie continued, "are listed as a Mr. George Fenn and a Mr. Robert Alt. I'd like to know which county they reside in, because the clerk's signature on the altered agreement is identical to the clerk's signature on every payment receipt, meaning the same man who processed our payments for 2 years also witnessed the document that erased them." She paused. "I'd like a judge to hear that. A judge who hasn't already signed something on your behalf." Harwick took 1 step toward her. Grayson Harper moved from the fireplace. He didn't do anything dramatic. He simply moved 3 steps, putting himself at Evie's left side, close enough to be unambiguously positioned, and then he stopped and looked at Harwick with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely clear. "I think," Grayson said, "that this conversation needs to stop here." Harwick looked at him. "Your Grace, this is a private legal. It stopped being private when you chose to conduct it in someone else's house in front of 30 witnesses." Grayson's voice was unhurried and without any particular heat, which made it considerably more effective than shouting would have been. "I'm also going to inform you that this matter has already been filed in Federal Circuit Court. Judge Harold Patton, Richmond." He let that land for a moment. "The county writ you've produced this morning is superseded by a federal preliminary filing, which means the seizure cannot proceed without Judge Patton's direct order, which he will not give, because the evidence being submitted to him makes clear that the original note was never in default." The man with the leather case went very still. Harwick's face finally moved. It wasn't much a tightening around the eyes, a fraction of a shift in the jaw, but in a face that controlled itself as carefully as his, it was significant. "You've been building a case against me," he said. He said it quietly, and it was not a question. "For 8 months," Grayson said, Miss Hart's receipts are the final piece. The filing moves to active this week." Harwick was silent for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to Mirabelle, and Evie watched something pass between them. A look that lasted less than a heartbeat, but carried the weight of a much longer conversation, and she understood with the sudden settling clarity of something that had been at the edge of her understanding all along, that Lady Mirabelle Ashford was not simply a candidate at a bride selection. She was Harwick's niece, and she had been here, had always been here, not just to win the Duke's attention, but to ensure that whatever happened with the Duke's land, and the Hart property, and the water rights, and the Eastern County, it resolved in her family's favor. Evie looked at Mirabelle. "You knew?" she said. "The whole time." Mirabelle's composure did not break. It never broke, that was the thing about her. But something shifted behind her eyes, a recalculation that went very fast. "I don't know what you think you're implying," she said. "You told me not to mistake attention for protection." Evie kept her voice level. "That was a message from him, wasn't it? He sent you here. The selection was what cover access, a reason to be in this house and near this man." She gestured toward Grayson without looking away from Mirabelle. "While Harwick moved on 4 different properties, you were here making sure nobody was watching closely enough to see it." Mirabelle's chin lifted. "This is embarrassing, Evelyn, for you." "Maybe." Evie turned away from her. "But I'm not the one who needs to explain my family connections to a federal judge." The room had gone so quiet that the sound of a horse on the drive outside was plainly audible. It was Edmund. He came through the front door with the focused speed of a man who had ridden hard and had something to show for it, and he stopped when he saw the assembled crowd and recalibrated in about 2 seconds. "Your Grace," he said, crossing to Grayson and handing him a sealed envelope. "Briggs sent this ahead. He's 2 hours behind me." Grayson broke the seal. Harwick watched him read. For the first time since he had walked into this house, something in his bearing was not entirely controlled. "What is it?" Harwick said. Grayson looked up. 3 sworn affidavits. 2 from property owners in Cumberland County, 1 from the land registrar in Richmond. He folded the envelope. "The registrar has identified your clerk's signature on 14 altered documents across 5 counties over the past 3 years. 14. He looked at Harwick steadily. "This isn't a property dispute anymore. This is a pattern of criminal fraud, and it has been presented to Judge Patton in its entirety." Harwick's man with the leather case put the case on the floor. Quietly, like someone setting down something he didn't want to be seen holding. "Robert," Harwick said to him. Robert did not respond. "Robert." Sharper now. The man straightened and said without looking at Harwick, "I think I need to speak with a lawyer, sir. My own lawyer." The room absorbed that. Lady Mirabelle made a small sound that was not quite a word. Harwick turned to look at her. And what passed between them now was not a question, but an accusation, rapid and silent and ugly. Mirabelle stepped back. 1 step, then 2. She separated herself from his position in the room the way you separated yourself from a fire that had gotten out of control, not run, not hide, just enough distance to make the distinction clear. "I have no involvement in any legal matter," she said to the room at large, to no one in particular. "I am a guest at this hall for entirely personal reasons." "Mirabelle," Harwick said. His voice had lost its pleasantness completely. "Lord Harwick," she said, and her voice was the smoothest, coolest thing in the room. "I think you should go." The silence after that was extraordinary. Grayson looked at Mrs. Caldwell. "I apologize for the disruption to your household," he said. "I believe the legal matter is resolved for today. The rest will proceed through proper channels." He looked at Harwick. "You'll be hearing from Judge Patton's office within the week. I'd advise you not to take any further action regarding any property in this county in the interim." Harwick looked at him, then at Evie, then at the receipts still sitting on the side table where she had placed them. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it, and he walked out of Caldwell Hall without another word, and his man Robert followed him at a distance that made clear they were no longer associated. The front door closed. The room exhaled. Yay. It did not go easy after that. Nothing real ever did. Mrs. Caldwell had what could generously be called a moment of composure failure in the privacy of her sitting room, which Evie knew about only because Tilda reported it in a whispered rush while Evie was gathering her things. 3 of the 10 candidates decided the week's events had made the selection uncertain enough that they would be returning home. Charlotte Aldridge announced this in a voice designed to be heard across the room, and then looked at Evie as though expecting some reaction, and Evie gave her none because there was too much else happening, and Charlotte Aldridge was very far from the top of her current list. Mirabelle Ashford did not leave. She withdrew, which was different to the upstairs rooms, and she did not come down again that afternoon. Whatever calculations she was running behind that composed expression, she was running them alone, and she was running them fast. Evie sat with Edmund in the smaller parlor for 40 minutes, while he went through the details of what Briggs had assembled, and she asked every question she could think of, and at the end she understood enough of the legal structure to know that it was real, and it was solid, and it was going to hold as long as nothing disrupted the filing in the next 72 hours. What could disrupt it, she said. Edmund hesitated in a way she recognized the hesitation of someone weighing how much to say. The receipts need to be with Briggs by tomorrow evening. If Harwick can get his hands on them before then... He stopped. He'd destroy them, she said. He'd try to discredit them. There are men who can be paid to say they witnessed a document being altered, if you understand me. Edmund looked uncomfortable. And Harwick has considerably more resources available than my family does. She said it plainly because it was plainly true. I understand. She looked at the receipts in the basket on her lap. I'll carry them to Briggs myself if I have to. Edmund blinked. Miss Hart. I said I'll carry them. She stood up. Tell me where he is. Edmund opened his mouth, then closed it, then said, He'll be at the Falcon Inn on the Richmond Road by tonight. He rode from Philadelphia in stages. Good. She picked up her basket. Miss Hart. Edmund rose. The Duke would want to... Tell him I'll be back before supper, she said, and walked out. She made it as far as the front drive before Grayson caught up with her. He did not grab her arm or raise his voice. He came around in front of her and stopped, which forced her to either stop or walk through him, and she stopped. Edmund told you, she said. Edmund tells me everything. It's why I keep him. He looked at her. You're not riding to Richmond alone. I'm not riding to Richmond. I'm riding to the Falcon Inn, which is half that distance on a road I've taken a dozen times. She held his gaze. I appreciate what you did in there today. I am genuinely grateful for it. But I'm not in the habit of needing permission. I'm not asking you to get permission. Something moved in his face, not frustration exactly. Something more honest than frustration. I'm asking you to let me come with you. She looked at him. Not because you need protection, he said, because Harwick is going to hear about this within the hour, and he is going to do something, and I don't know yet whether what he does will be legal or not, and if it's not... He stopped himself. I would like to be there. Not between you and whatever comes. Beside you. He paused. There's a difference. Evie thought about that. She thought about how many times in her life someone had offered to help her and meant something other than help. She thought about the receipts and the ledger and the 11 months since her father's hands had first started shaking. She thought about riding down the county road alone with everything that mattered in a sewing basket and a man like Harwick somewhere behind her. Fine, she said. But you don't speak for me unless I ask you to. Understood. And you don't make decisions about what to do next without talking to me first. Agreed. And if Briggs has questions about the documentation, I answer them. Obviously. Something shifted in his expression, the thing that came before a smile. You're the one who found it. You answer every question. She turned and started walking. Keep up, she said. He fell into step beside her, and she was acutely, uncomfortably aware of how natural that felt, and she decided not to think about it until the receipts were safely in Briggs's hands. They were an hour down the road when the rider caught up with them. He came from behind fast enough that Evie heard the hoofbeats and felt her shoulders tighten before she'd consciously identified the sound as a threat. Grayson heard it too. She saw him turn, and then they both saw. It was not one of Harwick's men. It was Tilda on the Caldwell Hall mare, riding with considerably more urgency than Tilda typically applied to anything. She pulled up alongside them, breathless. "He went to your father," she said, and she was looking at Evie. "Harwick went to your father's property with a new man, not the lawyer, someone different, bigger." She caught her breath. "Your father came to the hall looking for you. He's there now. He's—" She stopped. "Is he hurt?" Evie said. "Not hurt. But Evie—" Tilda looked at her with the expression of someone delivering the worst part. "He signed something. Harwick had a new document. He told your father it was an extension, that it would give him 6 more months. Your father signed it." The road was very quiet. Summer birds. The sound of her own heartbeat. "What did he actually sign?" she said. Tilda shook her head. "He doesn't know. He didn't have his reading glasses. Harwick read it to him, and what Harwick read—" She stopped again. "It wasn't what the paper said, Evie. One of the farmhands heard the whole thing. He said the man read one thing and the paper said something different. The farmhand can't read either, but he could see the paper, and he could hear what was being read, and they didn't match," Grayson said quietly. "If your father signed a document under false representation—" "I know what that means." Evie turned her horse. "I need to get back." "Evie!" Tilda caught her reins. "The farmhand. His name is Jacob Marsh. He'll testify. He said so. He's been on your father's land for 20 years, and he said he'll stand in front of any judge and say what he heard." Evie looked at her. Something hot and aching moved through her chest. Not quite grief, not quite relief, but something between the two that she didn't have a name for. "Tell him I said thank you," she said. She looked at Grayson. He was already turning his horse. "Briggs," she said. "I'll send Edmund ahead tonight. Briggs can wait at the inn, it's one evening." He met her eyes. "Your father needs to see those receipts, Miss Hart. He needs to understand that whatever he signed today doesn't change what's already in federal court." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice entirely right now, and that was a new and unwelcome development. They rode back toward the Hart property, and the July sun was direct and relentless overhead, and she thought about her father standing in his own kitchen while a man read him words that weren't on the page. And she thought about 20 years of Jacob Marsh working their land and watching and remembering. And she thought about all the ordinary people in this county who had been inside Harwick's machinery without anyone stopping long enough to pull them out. She thought about what it meant to finally have someone riding beside her who was pointed in the same direction. And she thought very briefly, very carefully, the way you thought about a flame near something dry, about the fact that Grayson Harper had said beside you with no qualifiers attached, and had looked at her when he said it in a way that suggested he had meant it in more than one sense. She pushed that thought flat. Not now. But the fact that she couldn't push it entirely away told her something she wasn't ready to name yet. Thomas Hart was sitting at the kitchen table when they came through the door, and this time he did not have the look of a man who had set something down. He had the look of a man who had been standing in a room while the floor gave way and had not yet entirely finished falling. He looked at Evie. He looked at the Duke beside her. He looked back at Evie. "I signed something," he said. "I know." She sat across from him the way she had sat the night before, and she put the receipt packet on the table between them. "And we're going to fix it. But first you're going to tell me every word Harwick said in the order he said it, and then you're going to tell me what the document looked like, any detail. Any word you caught, any number you saw on the page." Thomas nodded slowly. Grayson pulled out a chair and sat without ceremony, and he set his notebook on the table and uncapped his pen, and he looked at Thomas Hart with the same level attention he had given the receipts the night before, patient and focused and entirely without condescension. Thomas looked at him for a moment. "You're helping my daughter," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't entirely a statement. It was a man trying to understand the shape of something new. "I am," Grayson said. "Why?" Grayson was quiet for a moment. He looked at his notebook. Then he looked up at Thomas with an honesty that Evie felt physically the way you felt a shift in the air before rain. "Because she's the kind of person who finds the locked box and opens it," he said. "And I have spent a great deal of my life in rooms where everyone had a locked box and nobody opened anything." Thomas Hart studied him for a long time. Then he straightened in his chair, and he folded his hands on the table, and he began. Harwick said the first line was, "extension of existing terms," he said. He read it slow like he wanted me to follow. Then he said, and Evie listened, and Grayson wrote, and somewhere down the Eastern County Road, a man named Harwick was running out of moves without knowing it yet. The farmhand named Jacob Marsh was going to make sure of that, and so was she. Jacob Marsh was a man of 60, with a face carved by 30 years of Virginia summers, and a voice that didn't waste itself on anything that wasn't worth saying. He came through the Hart kitchen door, 20 minutes after Evie and Grayson arrived hat in hand, and he stood in the doorway with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply waiting for the room to be ready. "You heard it," Evie said. "Every word." He looked at Thomas first, then at Evie, then at Grayson, with a brief assessment that said he had decided to reserve judgment. "I was at the fence on the north side when Harwick's man pulled up. I stayed where I was because, well, I reckon I didn't like the look of them." He turned his hat in his hands. He read that paper slow, like reading to a child, said it was an extension. 6 months, same terms, no penalty. That's what he said out loud. "And the paper," Grayson said. "What did you see on it?" Jacob Marsh looked at him. "I can't read cursive well enough to make out words from 10 feet back, but I can count." He read 3 lines. The paper had 12. He paused. "A 3-line extension don't take 12 lines." Grayson wrote that down. "Would you say that in front of a judge?" "Already said I would." He looked at Thomas. "You've been good to this land and good to the men on it. That counts for something." Thomas Hart's jaw worked for a moment. He nodded once and didn't trust himself to say anything else. Grayson set down his pen. "What Harwick read was an extension. What your father signed was almost certainly a deed transfer. Partial or complete." He looked at Evie directly. "It doesn't matter. A document signed under false representation with a witness who can testify to the discrepancy between what was read and what was written is void. It cannot be recorded, it cannot be enforced, and attempting to record it after the fact is fraud, compounded on fraud." He paused. "We need Briggs to confirm the document's actual content and file the affidavit." "Edmund," Evie started. "I'm here." Edmund's voice came from the doorway behind Jacob Marsh, and he stepped through looking like a man who had ridden considerably faster than expected. Behind him, carrying a leather case that was considerably fuller than the one Harwick's lawyer had produced that morning, was a compact, sharp-eyed man in a gray coat. "Caldwell Briggs," he said to the room in general. He looked at Evie. "You're Miss Hart." It was not a question. "I am. Edmund told me about the document your father signed this afternoon." He set his case on the table without ceremony. "I need to see it." Thomas reached into his coat and produced the paper. He set it on the table and smoothed it flat, and then stepped back like a man distancing himself from something he wished he'd never touched. Briggs read it in 45 seconds. Then he read it again slower. "Deed of conveyance," he said flatly. "Partial transfer. The north 30 acres including water access to the creek." He looked up. If this were recorded, Harwick would control the creek, which means he'd control irrigation for your entire remaining property and access to the eastern road boundary. He set it down. He didn't want the land, he wanted the water. The kitchen was very quiet. Evie looked at her father. Thomas Hart sat down slowly in his chair. "I didn't know," he said. "I couldn't." He stopped. "You couldn't see it," she said. "He read you something else. That's on him, Papa. Not you." Jacob's testimony makes this document unenforceable, Briggs said, clicking open his case. But I want it on paper tonight. Mr. Marsh. He looked at the farmhand. Can you give me 30 minutes? I've got nothing else pressing, Jacob said, and sat down. While Briggs worked with Jacob at one end of the table, and Thomas sat at the other end, saying things quietly, and Grayson reviewed documents nearby, Evie stepped outside. She stood on the back step in the July heat and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. She thought about the creek. She thought about how Harwick had sat in her family's kitchen and read her father words that weren't there, slow and patient, the way you fed poison to someone in small enough doses that they didn't taste it. She thought about how many people he had done this to 14 properties, Briggs had said. 14 families who had signed documents they hadn't seen clearly enough to question. She heard the door behind her. She didn't turn around. He's done, Grayson said. He's been doing this for 3 years, and he's done. You don't know that yet. I know the filing. I know what Briggs has. And I know what Jacob Marsh is signing right now at that table. He came to stand beside her. Not too close. The exact amount of distance that said he was aware of the line and not crossing it. It's over for Harwick. The question now is the cleanup. My father signed a deed transfer that we can prove was obtained by fraud with a live witness and a federal filing that supersedes the county court entirely. He paused. Your father's land is not going anywhere, Miss Hart. She turned to look at him. In the late afternoon light, he looked tired, in the way that was honest, the kind of tired that came from doing something real rather than performing something exhausting. And she found she couldn't look at it for too long without something in her chest doing something she hadn't asked it to do. Why didn't you tell me sooner, she said, about the filing, about all of it? You let me walk into that hall this morning thinking I only had the receipts. He was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't want you walking in there relying on me, he said. I wanted you walking in there knowing you had what you needed. The receipts were yours. What you said to Harwick in that room, that was yours. He met her eyes. I wasn't going to take that from you by making you feel like you needed my filing to stand on. Evie looked at him for a long time. That is, she said slowly, either the most genuinely decent thing anyone has ever said to me or the most sophisticated piece of flattery I've encountered in my life. Something moved in his expression, warm and real and briefly unguarded. Could be both. She almost smiled. She stopped herself. Don't push it, she said, and went back inside. The letter arrived just before sundown, and it came from Caldwell Hall, and it was addressed to Grayson in handwriting that Evie recognized immediately. He read it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but he folded it carefully and looked at Briggs. Mirabelle Ashford has her uncle's original clerk testimony, he said. The one where the clerk signed a sworn account of the payment processing on 4 properties, including this one. Harwick gave it to her to hold 3 months ago. He trusted her more than any lockbox. Briggs looked up sharply. She has a signed testimony from the clerk, the one whose signature is on the receipts. She does. Grayson looked at Evie. She wants to meet. Here. The word sat in the kitchen like an object someone had dropped. Here, Evie repeated. Tonight. She says she'll bring it herself. He held the letter out to her. Evie took it. She read it in the time it took to breathe in and out twice. I am not my uncle. I was not told what he intended to do with the property or the people on it. I want that to be clear. I am prepared to provide what I have to whomever it serves best. M.A. She wants protection, Evie said. Yes. If Harwick finds out she gave up that testimony, her family position is already compromised. She knows that. Grayson watched her face. What she has is the most important piece of the case. The clerk's own account, in his own hand. Evie set the letter down. She thought about Mirabelle telling her not to hover, telling her she looked desperate, telling her not to mistake attention for protection. She thought about the look that had passed between Mirabelle and Harwick in the main hall. The calculation, the quick withdrawal, the way Mirabelle had stepped back 2 paces and saved herself at her uncle's expense without hesitating. She didn't like Mirabelle Ashford. She didn't trust her. Both of those things were probably going to remain true indefinitely, but she understood her, and understanding was enough to work with. "Tell her to come," Evie said. Mirabelle arrived at the Hart property at dusk without a carriage, in a plain dress that Evie had never seen her wear before. She came in through the front door when Evie opened it, and she looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone recalibrating every assumption they had made, and then she set a folded document on the table and stepped back. "The clerk's name is Paul Fenton," she said. "He's been with my uncle's lending house for 9 years. 3 months ago, Harwick had him write a sworn account of the payment processing on 4 properties, including yours, because he was nervous about his own exposure. He gave it to me to hold." She looked at Grayson. "He said it was insurance." "Insurance against what?" Briggs said. "Against me." She said it flatly. "If I ever told anyone about his operation, this document with my name on the covering letter would make it look like I was his partner in all of it." She paused. "Which I was not. I knew he was buying land. I didn't know how." "Until today," Evie said. Mirabelle looked at her. "Until today. And now you're giving us the document that implicates him. I'm giving you the document that clears me and ends him. There's a difference." She held Evie's gaze. It was the most direct Mirabelle had ever looked at her. No calculation in it, no performance, just one woman being honest with another. "I'm not here because I like you, Evelyn. I'm here because my uncle used me as a safeguard, and I am not going to spend the rest of my life being somebody's insurance." Evie looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," she said. "We have work to do." The sun had fully set when the knock came at the front door, and this time it was not someone they were expecting. It was the county sheriff. Behind him, at a distance of about 6 feet that communicated very precisely how he felt about the association, was Lord Harwick. Evie opened the door and looked at the sheriff first, because the sheriff was the one who mattered. Franklin Reeves had been the county sheriff for 11 years. He was not a complicated man. He did his job. He kept his head down, and he had a strong preference for situations that could be resolved without anyone raising their voice. He was looking at Evie now with the expression of a man who had been put in a position he hadn't asked for, and was trying to navigate it with his dignity intact. "Miss Hart," he said, "I'm sorry to call so late. I've been—" He glanced back at Harwick. "Lord Harwick has requested that I accompany him to this property in his capacity as—" "I know what he wants," Evie said. She looked past the sheriff. "He can't have it." Harwick stepped forward. "There is a signed document. That was obtained by fraud in front of a witness," Evie said. "We have an affidavit, and a federal filing with Judge Harold Patton in Richmond, and the sworn testimony of your own clerk." She paused. "Sheriff Reeves, I'd like you to come inside. There's something you should read before this conversation goes any further." Reeves looked at Harwick. Harwick's jaw was tight in the way of a man who had expected this to be simpler. "Franklin," he said with the easy familiarity of old association, "the document is signed." "Come in, Sheriff," Grayson said from behind Evie. Reeves came in. It took 20 minutes for Briggs to walk the sheriff through the case file, and the sheriff was quiet through most of it, turning pages with the careful attention of a man who was reading something he wished he wasn't. When Briggs finished, Reeves sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Judge Hollis signed a writ this morning," he said. "We know," Grayson said. "I served it." "I know that too." Reeves looked at him. "I didn't know what I was serving." "I believe you." The sheriff put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at the case file, and then he looked at Evie, and she could see the moment he made the decision, not fast, but definite, the way a man made a decision when he had looked at both sides and found one of them weighed considerably more than the other. "I'm going to need to speak with Judge Hollis," he said, "tonight. You might want to know," Briggs said, opening his case, "that I received a telegraph this afternoon from the Richmond Circuit Court. Judge Hollis has been notified of the federal filing. He has recused himself from any further action on the Hart property matter. He set the telegraph on the table. As of this afternoon, his writ is void. The room was very quiet. Reeves picked up the telegraph, read it, set it down. "Well," he said. He looked at the door. "I need to go speak to Lord Harwick." "That would be useful," Evie said. Reeves went outside. They heard two voices. Reeves low and steady, Harwick starting controlled and getting less so. They heard the specific quality of silence that comes when a man finally understands that the ground has shifted completely and there is no direction left that doesn't require retreat. Then they heard one set of footsteps on the drive moving away. Reeves came back in. He looked at Thomas Hart, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table for the last hour with the look of a man watching a storm pass over land he had built with his own hands. "Mr. Hart," Reeves said, "your property is not being touched tonight, or any night if what this file says holds up in court." He paused. "And I think it'll hold up." Thomas Hart nodded. His throat moved. He said nothing. Briggs began packing his case. Mirabelle gathered her own document. She stood, and she looked at Evie across the table, and she said, "For what it's worth," in a tone that carried more complexity than Evie was expecting. "You were always the most interesting person in the room. I just didn't have the sense to admit it." Evie held her gaze. "You could have made different choices before today." "Yes." Mirabelle held the gaze without flinching. "I know that." She walked out. The kitchen felt different after she left, not easier exactly, but clearer, like a room after a window had been opened. Jacob Marsh left next with a handshake from Thomas that lasted longer than handshakes usually did, and Edmund followed Briggs out to discuss the timeline for the Richmond filing, and then it was only Evie and Grayson and Thomas in the kitchen, and the lamp burning low, and the July night coming in through the open window. Thomas looked at Grayson with the same evaluating look he'd used at midnight 2 days ago when Grayson had first sat across from him at this table. Only now the quality of the look was different. It was a man who had been given evidence and had processed it. "You could have done this without her," Thomas said. "You had the filing. You had Briggs." "The receipts were the piece that made the case unbreakable," Grayson said. "I'm not talking about the receipts." Thomas's voice was deliberate. "I'm talking about everything else." Grayson looked at him. He didn't look away. "No," he said. "I couldn't have." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to bed." And he stood up and squeezed Evie's shoulder as he passed her, the way he had done since she was small, and he walked out of the kitchen without another word. The quiet he left behind had weight. Evie looked at the table, at the lamp, at the receipt packet, at the place where Harwick's forged document had sat before Briggs took it as evidence. She felt the specific exhaustion of a person who had spent 3 days running toward something and had finally arrived at it and didn't quite know yet what to do with the stillness on the other side. "It's done," she said. "The land is secure." "Pending Richmond," Grayson said. "But yes. Your water rights are protected." "They are." She looked up at him. "So you got what you came for?" He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, quiet and undefended, the kind of honesty she had started to recognize as specific to him, the thing he did when he decided a performance wasn't worth the cost. "I told you," he said, "that it stopped feeling like only that." She held very still. "You're going back to Philadelphia." "I have business there, yes. And the selection." She said it evenly. "There are still 7 candidates at Caldwell Hall." "There are." He didn't look away from her. "Though I think we both know the selection concluded some time ago." Evie looked at him. "I haven't said anything you haven't seen clearly for yourself," he said. "I'm not saying it now to take advantage of a long day or a room with no one else in it. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know where I stand, clearly, without me hiding it inside useful gestures." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark and the heat-heavy summer night, and she took a long, slow breath. "I don't know what to do with you," she said. It came out more honest than she had intended. "I know." His voice was quiet. "You don't have to know tonight." She turned around. He was exactly where he had been, steady, undemanding, giving her the room she needed without pretending he didn't want to close it. "My father trusts you," she said. "That matters to me." "I'm not my father." "No," he said. "You are considerably more difficult." She felt something loosen in her chest. Something that had been braced since the moment she had looked up in that parlor and found him looking back. She felt it loosen, and she almost let it. "Go back to Caldwell Hall," she said. "Deal with whatever needs dealing with, and—" She stopped. "And—" She looked at him for a moment. At the steadiness of him. At the way he had sat in her father's kitchen at midnight and ridden down the county road beside her and stood at her left shoulder in a room full of people with power, and made it clear without a word of declaration which direction he was pointed. "Come back," she said. "When it's finished, come back and we'll talk." Grayson Harper picked up his hat from the chair. He looked at her with that expression she had stopped trying to name, the one that was warm and careful and entirely without pretense. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked out and the door closed and the kitchen was quiet, and Evie stood in it with her hands still and her heartbeat doing something she had completely stopped trying to manage. Outside, she heard his horse move down the lane. She sat back down at her table. She picked up the receipt packet, her father's 12 receipts worn at the edges from being handled and carried and held up in a room full of people who hadn't expected her to have anything worth showing, and she looked at them for a long moment. Then she set them down, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she let herself feel it, all of it, the fear of the last 3 days, and the exhaustion, and the thing she couldn't quite name, that had been growing since a man crossed a parlor in summer and looked at her like she was the only person worth looking at. She felt it. And then she got up and went to check the door latch and put out the lamp and went to bed. Tomorrow was going to require everything she had. She intended to be ready for it. The letter from Richmond arrived on the 3rd morning. It came with the early post before Thomas had finished his coffee, and Evie saw it first, the Federal Circuit Court seal in the upper left corner. Judge Harold Patton's name printed beneath it. She set down her cup and picked it up and turned it over in her hands for a moment, before she gave it to her father, because she wanted 1 second to prepare herself for whichever direction it went. Thomas broke the seal. He read it slowly, the way he read everything that mattered. Evie watched his face. She saw it when he reached the 3rd line. His jaw shifted. His hands, which had been steady for the first time in 3 days, went briefly unsteady and then steadier than they had been in months. "It's done," he said. She breathed out. "Criminal indictment." He set the letter on the table. Harwick. 5 counties, 14 properties, fraud and criminal misrepresentation. He pressed his fingertips flat against the paper. Paul Fenton entered a full confession. The fraudulent deed transfer has been voided. The property is confirmed. He stopped talking. Evie put her hand over his. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Neither did she. There was nothing that needed to be said, nothing that words could do better than the silence of 2 people who had been holding something together for a very long time and had finally been allowed to let it down. Then Thomas Hart, who had not cried in front of his daughter since her mother's funeral, made a sound that was almost nothing, and turned his face briefly toward the window, and Evie kept her hand where it was and looked at the wall and gave him the privacy of not watching. "Your mother would have liked to see this," he said again. The same words he had used before. But this time they sounded different, less like grief, and more like something she couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe. Completion. She would have, Evie said. "Woman." Edmund arrived an hour later, which meant he had ridden from Caldwell Hall before dawn, which meant he had known about the letter before it arrived, which meant Grayson had told him to come. He came to the front door with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who had been given a task he was not entirely sure how to execute. Evie let him in, poured him coffee he didn't ask for, and waited. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about my cousin." He looked into the coffee cup. "He'll likely be angry that I'm telling you, but I think you should know before the 2 of you." He stopped. "I think you should know." Evie sat down across from him. "Say it," Edmund wrapped both hands around the cup. When Grayson's father was dying 3 years ago, he made Grayson promise to attend the Virginia selection. Not any selection, this one specifically. It had been arranged years in advance through the Caldwells. He paused. The promise wasn't, "Find a suitable bride." That's what everyone assumed. That's what the selection was organized around. He looked up at her. What his father actually said was, "Find someone who doesn't need you to be the Duke." Those were his exact words, because his father had married for position a woman who wanted the title, not the man, and they had both been miserable, and he didn't want that for Grayson. Evie looked at him. "He came here intending to fulfill the obligation and go home," Edmund continued. "He told me that on the first day. He said, 'I'll be polite, I'll be thorough, and I'll leave.'" He shook his head. "And then he walked into that parlor, and you were sitting in the corner fixing a hem and actively trying not to exist, and he stopped walking." Edmund put the cup down. "I've ridden with that man for 10 years. I have never seen him stop walking." The kitchen was very quiet. Evie thought about her father saying powerful men don't ride to Virginia without a reason that serves themselves. She thought about how that was true, and also somehow not the whole truth at all. "He ended the selection this morning," Edmund said. "Formally. Released all remaining candidates, offered the Caldwells a generous settlement for the disruption, and apologized to each candidate personally." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Caldwell has opinions about this." "I imagine she does. Most of the opinions are about you." "I imagine those too." Edmund almost smiled. "He's coming here this afternoon. I'm telling you now because he won't tell you any of this himself. He won't tell you because—" He paused, choosing. "Because he's spent his entire life in rooms where people wanted something from him, and he has gotten very careful about the distance between what he feels and what he says out loud. He'll tell you what he wants. He won't tell you what it cost him to get to the point of wanting it." He stood up. "I thought you should have both pieces." Evie sat with that for a moment. "Edmund," she said. "Miss Hart? You're a better man than you let people see." He picked up his hat. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." He walked out. Tilda came 30 minutes after Edmund left, which meant half of Harwick County was apparently conducting their mourning around the Hart kitchen table, and Evie had stopped being surprised by any of it. "He did it," Tilda said before she was fully through the door. "He ended the whole selection. Charlotte Aldridge is inconsolable. Ann Mercer left before breakfast. Mrs. Caldwell—" "I heard," Evie said. "She's saying he was manipulated." Tilda dropped into a chair. "She's saying it to anyone who'll listen. That a seamstress with a land dispute—" She stopped when she saw Evie's face. "Sorry." "Don't be." Evie looked at the window. "She's not entirely wrong about the land dispute. She's entirely wrong about the rest." Tilda folded her hands. "Evie, what are you going to do?" Evie thought about that. She thought about all the things she knew clearly and all the things she was still working out. And she thought about the specific problem of a man who had sat in her kitchen at midnight, ridden down the county road beside her, stood at her shoulder, in a room full of people who wanted her gone, and then told her plainly where he stood, and she still hadn't given him a real answer. "I'm going to go work in the garden," she said. "And I'm going to wait." Tilda stared at her. "That's your plan." "That's my plan." She heard his horse on the lane at 2:30, and she kept working. She was in the kitchen garden on the east side of the house, the part her mother had planted and her father had maintained, and that Evie had tended every summer since she was 12, and she was doing something real and ordinary and necessary. Because if she stood around waiting for this conversation, her brain was going to process it into something complicated that it didn't need to be. She heard his boots on the path. She kept her hands moving. "Miss Hart?" "Your Grace." She didn't look up. "There's a chair on the left if you want to sit." A pause. Then the sound of a chair being moved and the specific quiet of someone sitting down in a garden in the middle of a Virginia afternoon. "The letter came," he said. "It did. Your father." He's well. She moved to the next row. He read it 3 times. Then he went out to the pasture to check the fence, which is his version of needing to be alone with something good. Grayson was quiet for a moment. I'm glad. Edmund came this morning, she said. A pause that was slightly different from the others. I know. He told me about your father, about what he actually asked you to promise. Another pause, longer. Edmund has a habit of, don't be angry with him, she said. She stopped working and stood up and looked at him. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, hat in his hands, and he was looking at her with that expression that she had spent 5 days trying to name and had finally stopped trying. He told me because he thought I should know. He was right. Grayson held her gaze. What I feel isn't contingent on what my father asked for, he said. I want that clear. What I feel is mine. I know? She set down her tool. That's what I'm trying to decide what to do with. He looked at her, waiting, not pushing. She walked to the fence post and leaned against it, and she looked at her own hands for a moment because she was about to say something she had not said to anyone, and she wanted to say it right. I've been useful my whole life, she said. Since I was old enough to thread a needle, I've been useful. To my father, to every house in this county that needed a hem fixed to you. I found the receipts I got on my knees in Charlotte Aldridge's dressing room. I stood in that hall and said the right things at the right moment. She looked up. And I am not complaining about any of it. It's who I am, and I'm not ashamed of it. But, she stopped. But, he said. But I am terrified, she said quietly, of becoming useful to you. In the same way. Indispensable and overlooked. The person who solves things and gets thanked and then goes back to the corner. She said it. It was out. The garden was very still. Grayson set his hat down on the ground. He stood up, and he walked to the fence where she was standing, and he stopped close enough to be honest, and far enough to be respectful, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing performed in it whatsoever. You have a habit, he said, of deciding things without asking for a full accounting. She blinked. I beg your pardon. You assumed I noticed the receipts. I noticed you. He said it plainly. I noticed that you measured every word before you spent it. I noticed that when Harwick threatened your father's house, your first instinct was to think, not to cry. I noticed that you looked at Mirabelle Ashford, a woman who had been unkind to you for 3 days, and you said, sit down, we have work to do because you needed what she had, and that was more important than what you felt. He paused. I noticed that when I told you the land was secure, you said so you got what you came for, which is what you say to someone when you're testing whether they're about to leave. Evie stood very still. I am not leaving, he said. And you're not a corner. You have never once in your life been a corner. The silence between them had a completely different quality now. You closed the selection, she said. Yes. Mrs. Caldwell will recover. She's a practical woman. Something moved in his expression, that warmth she had stopped fighting. I told her that I had found exactly what my father sent me here to find. Someone who doesn't need me to be the Duke. He looked at her. She asked who. I told her. She did not take it well, but that's a temporary condition. Evie let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for about 4 days. What exactly are you proposing? That's an interesting word choice. I meant it plainly. I know you did. He held her gaze. I'm proposing that I finish my business in Philadelphia, settle my affairs, and come back here with the intention of building something, with you. On terms you find acceptable, at a pace you find reasonable, with every decision made between us, rather than by me alone. He paused. And I'm aware that none of that sounds like a romantic declaration. But you're not a woman who wants a performance. You want the actual thing. Evie looked at him. She thought about the last 5 days, the parlor, the midnight kitchen, the county road, the farmhand who'd stood up and the clerk who'd confessed, and the moment Mirabelle had set a document on this table and said, I am not my uncle. She thought about all the people who had made different choices, when the easier choice was right there in front of them, and what it said about a person that they chose, the harder thing anyway. She thought about Grayson Harper stopping in the middle of that parlor. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask it." "When you crossed that room in the parlor the first day, before you knew about the receipts, before you knew about Harwick, before any of it." She held his gaze. "Why?" He didn't hesitate. "Because you were the only person in the room who wasn't performing," he said. "And I had forgotten what that looked like." Something in Evie's chest opened. Not the way she'd expected. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just open. Like a window that had been painted shut for so long she'd stopped noticing it, and now the air was coming through. A door on the far side of the house opened and closed. Footsteps she recognized, her father's particular unhurried weight on the path. Thomas Hart came around the corner and stopped when he saw them at the fence. He looked at Grayson. He looked at Evie. He looked at Grayson again with the expression of a man doing an honest calculation. "Your Grace," he said. "Mr. Hart." Thomas looked at his daughter. "Well?" Evie looked at him. "I haven't answered yet, Papa." "How long are you planning to take?" "I'm considering." Thomas made a sound that was probably the most diplomatic noise he was capable of making, and sat down in the garden chair that Grayson had vacated. "Consider faster," he said with the equanimity of a man who has made his position clear and is content to wait. "It's hot." Evie turned back to Grayson. He was looking at her with something so transparent and so patient that it was almost difficult to look at the expression of a man who had made his case and was now simply waiting for the verdict without trying to influence it. "I don't need saving," she said. "I know. I don't need a title or a house or anyone's approval. I know that too. I'm difficult, and I ask too many questions, and I will absolutely not stop doing either. Evelyn." His voice was very quiet. "I walked across a parlor on the first day because you were the only real thing in the room. Do you think I've been under any illusions about your temperament since then?" She almost laughed. She felt it rise in her chest, and she let it just a little, the loosening of something that had been wound tight for so long she'd mistaken it for her own nature. "No," she said. "I suppose you haven't." He looked at her. "So." She looked at him. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not the idea of it, not the romance of it, but the actual daily practice of standing in front of another person and having them look back without flinching or performing or deciding in advance who you were supposed to be. She thought about how rare that was. She thought about how she had spent 31 years not knowing she was waiting for it. "Yes," she said. Just the one word. Plainly the way she said things that mattered. Grayson Harper exhaled a slow, quiet breath, the kind you let out when you've been holding something carefully for a very long time and finally find a safe place to set it down. "Well," Thomas Hart said from the garden chair, with the absolute dignity of a man pretending he had not been listening intently to every syllable, "that took long enough." "Papa," Evie said, "I'm just noting." He stood and brushed off his trousers with the unhurried composure of a man who had raised a daughter exactly like himself and found the experience both trying and deeply satisfying. He looked at Grayson. "You'll do right by her." "Yes, sir," Grayson said. "Every day." Thomas considered that. "See that you do." He walked back to the house and the door closed behind him. Jack. They stood at the fence in the July afternoon, and the heat was exactly what it had been all week, relentless and certain of itself the way Virginia summers were, and Evie felt it differently than she had before. Not lighter. She didn't believe in lighter, but clearer the way the air went after a storm had moved through and taken everything that didn't need to stay. "I have conditions," she said. "I'd expect nothing less. I keep working. I'm not becoming decorative. God forbid. My father stays on this land, with access to the creek, the pasture, everything. Already assumed. And we decide things together." She looked at him steadily. "All of it. Not just the things you decide to include me in. All of it." Grayson held her gaze. You have my word on all three." She nodded once. Then she picked up the tool she'd set down and turned back to the row she'd been working. "Are you going back to work?" he said. "Right now? The row doesn't finish itself." A pause. Then the sound of him moving and the particular quiet of someone crouching down to help without being asked. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him, a Duke of the Republic in good traveling clothes, kneeling in her mother's kitchen garden in the Virginia heat, asking what she needed in the tone of a man who intended to do whatever the answer was. She handed him the second tool. "Start at the far end," she said. "Work toward the middle." He did. They worked in the summer afternoon without performing anything for anyone. No audience, no occasion, no version of themselves shaped to fit what a room expected, and it was ordinary and real, and the most honest thing Evie had felt in longer than she could name. This was what being seen actually looked like. Not the moment in the parlor, not the midnight kitchen, not the county road with everything at stake. This. Two people at the end of a long fight, doing a small and necessary thing together, because that was what came after the daily ordinary of choosing the same direction. Evie Hart had spent her whole life being useful and being overlooked, and she had made her peace with it, the way you made your peace with weather, not happily, but completely. She had not expected to find someone who looked at everything she was and said, "That's exactly who I came here for." But she had, and she intended to keep him. That was enough. That was everything. That was where the story settled, not in a grand hall or a public declaration. But here in the garden, her mother planted in the county, her family had worked for 3 generations, in the quiet company of a man who had crossed a room full of perfect strangers to stand next to the one person trying hardest not to be seen. Evelyn Hart had been the one they called useless. She had turned out to be the only one worth choosing, and she had done it entirely on her own terms, which was the only way she had ever known how to do anything at all.